Dawn, get back! Call 911. It's attacking her.
The scream sliced through the air like a knife. In that instant, the entire audience went silent. Water exploded from the surface of the pool. Something massive, a blur of black and white, thrashed beneath the surface, dragging a figure into the depths. Just seconds ago, families had been clapping, children laughing, watching their favorite whale show at SeaWorld, Florida. Now they were witnessing a nightmare. A child sobbed. A mother clutched her daughter's face and turned her away from the tank. Phones dropped. People screamed. The blood in the water was real. The body floating limply just below the surface. Real. And the one doing it? Tilikum, the most famous killer whale in captivity, had just become a killer again. But to understand what really happened that afternoon, why a world-class trainer who spent her life loving animals met such a horrific end, we have to go back. Back to where it all began, before the lights, the screaming, and the silence that followed. Hi, and welcome to Animal Story, where we bring you the most powerful, real-life stories of the deep bond between humans and animals. But not all stories end in hugs and happy tears. Some end in tragedy. If you're drawn to stories that make you feel something, stories that reveal the raw beauty and danger of nature, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's talk about what really happened the day the water turned red at SeaWorld. It was supposed to be a regular afternoon at the Shamu Stadium in Orlando, Florida. Families lined up for snacks. Parents pointed excitedly as trainers prepped the pool area. "One of the whales is coming out today," someone whispered. At the heart of it all was Dawn Bronchot, a seasoned SeaWorld veteran and beloved animal trainer. With over 15 years of experience, she wasn't just good at her job, she was made for it. Her blonde ponytail, signature wetsuit, and calm voice made her a favorite not just with audiences, but with the whales themselves, especially with Tilikum. Tilikum, or Tilly, as staff affectionately called him, was massive, over 12,000 pounds, over 22 feet long. But to Dawn, he wasn't dangerous. He wasn't just a whale, he was her partner, her pride. Their bond was something spectators marveled at. He responded to her hand signals, to her voice, even to her emotions. People often said Dawn had a sixth sense around animals, and perhaps she did. But even the strongest bonds can be broken in a single moment. On February 24, 2010, after the Dine with Shamu show, Dawn lingered by the edge of the pool with Tilikum. There were no acrobatics, no cheering crowd, just her, the whale, and a few guests finishing lunch on the upper deck. She leaned down, playfully splashing water, just like she had done hundreds of times. And then, without warning, he lunged. Witnesses say he grabbed her ponytail and yanked her in with such force that her body flew like a rag doll. The calm, playful ripples on the surface turned into a raging storm. 1 second, she was waving. The next, she was gone beneath the surface. Panic erupted, staff ran. Someone shouted for the emergency protocol, but it was too late. What followed was the most violent, gruesome animal attack ever captured inside a marine park. It was quick, but also excruciatingly slow for those watching. Children screamed. Some guests were so traumatized they had to be treated by medics. And through it all, Tilikum swam in slow circles, still holding Dawn's body in his mouth. The people who loved her the most would later say, she trusted him with her life. And that trust was shattered. But how did it come to this? How did the most respected trainer at SeaWorld end up dying in the pool she loved the most? That's what we'll uncover in the next part of this story. Stick with us. And remember, not all animals can be tamed. Before the headlines, before the horror, before the world turned its eyes to a pool of blood and broken dreams. There was just Dawn. Dawn Branchot wasn't looking for fame. She wasn't chasing money or attention or glory. What she wanted, more than anything, was connection. Born in 1969 in Indiana, Dawn was the youngest of 6 children in a close-knit Catholic family. She grew up far from the ocean, but she was captivated by it. When she was 9 years old, her parents took her to SeaWorld during a family vacation to Florida. That trip changed her life. She watched in awe as a killer whale soared through the air, splashing water across the first few rows of seats. But while other kids were busy laughing or hiding from the splash, Dawn leaned forward. She wasn't afraid. She was enchanted. Years later, she told reporters, "That day, I knew I wanted to be one of the trainers. I wanted to be close to them, to understand them." And that's exactly what she did. After graduating from the University of South Carolina, with a degree in psychology and animal behavior, Dawn worked her way into SeaWorld's competitive training program. It wasn't easy. The job was physically demanding, emotionally exhausting, and dangerously unpredictable. But Dawn thrived. She had this calm, gentle energy that animals seemed to gravitate toward. Colleagues often said she had a gift. She didn't shout. She didn't dominate. She communicated with patience, empathy, and love. That's how she bonded with Tilikum, and that bond would become her legacy and her undoing. Tilikum wasn't your typical whale. Captured off the coast of Iceland in 1983, he was taken from his pod at just 2 years old, ripped from his family and dropped into a concrete tank. Over time, he was shuffled from park to park, used for shows, and forced to breed. He spent most of his life in captivity, confined to spaces no ocean creature should ever know. By the time he arrived at SeaWorld Orlando in 1992, Tilikum had already been involved in the deaths of 2 people. To the public, he was a majestic giant. To the trainers, he was a calculated risk. But to Dawn, he was misunderstood. She never denied his size or power. He was, after all, the largest orca in captivity. But she believed in something deeper, a shared trust, an emotional connection. She treated him like a person, one of her colleagues said. She respected him. She believed he could feel things the way we do. To Dawn, Tilikum wasn't dangerous. He was damaged. Their relationship became a fixture of SeaWorld shows. Crowds loved watching the gentle back and forth between the towering whale and the petite trainer. Dawn would stroke his tongue, ride his back, dive into the water beside him like they were lifelong companions. And he responded. He listened. He followed cues. He let her hug him in front of thousands of people. It was mesmerizing. And it built a myth that this whale was safe, as long as he was with Dawn. Families came from all over the country just to see them together. Kids pointed from the stands, whispering, "That's her. That's the whale lady." On social media, Dawn was celebrated not just as a trainer, but as a symbol of harmony between man and beast. But not everyone was convinced. A few staff members expressed quiet concern. "It's still a wild animal," one said in a private meeting. "We can't forget that." But Dawn never showed fear. Not once. In fact, in one interview, she smiled and said, "They're not just animals. They're partners. They're friends. You have to trust them and earn their trust in return." It was more than a job for her. It was a relationship built on love, and love, as powerful as it is, can blind us to danger. In the next part of this story, we'll explore how that beautiful bond began to crack, how the warning signs began to show, and how no one, not even Dawn, could see just how close she was to tragedy. Don't go anywhere. The story is only beginning. To outsiders, their connection looked perfect. When Dawn stepped onto the platform, Tilikum surfaced like a shadow from the deep. He'd wait, watching her with those enormous, unreadable eyes. She'd smile, wave to the crowd, and dive into the water as if nothing could ever go wrong. And for years, nothing did. Their chemistry seemed effortless. Dawn knew every gesture, every shift in behavior. She could sense when Tillicum was playful, moody, or distracted. He, in turn, responded with what seemed like affection. Slow, careful movements, vocalizations only she could interpret, and an almost childlike calmness when she was nearby. They were, in every sense, a team. Dawn wasn't just a trainer. She was a believer. She believed that love, consistency, and trust could break through anything, even the trauma of captivity. And maybe for a time it did. But that belief came with blind spots. The truth is, Tillicum wasn't like the other orcas. He was kept separate most of the time. Unlike the others, he didn't perform during the main shows because of past aggression. Most trainers weren't even allowed to swim with him. Only a few, like Dawn, had that privilege, or that risk. And there were signs, subtle at first, then louder. He'd hesitate during routines, ignore hand signals, occasionally refuse food, which was highly unusual for a killer whale in a show environment. Sometimes, after a successful routine, instead of waiting for the signal to exit, he'd linger, staring. Trainers called it inattentive behavior. And with orcas, especially those as large and unpredictable as Tillicum, inattentive often meant dangerous. During one private training session, he slapped his massive tail against the water with such force it soaked half the stadium. Dawn laughed it off, but others didn't. One newer trainer quietly expressed concern to a supervisor. "It's like he's testing the boundaries." Management acknowledged the behavior, but stuck to their protocol. Tillicum wasn't allowed in waterwork shows anymore, but dry platform interactions, like the ones Dawn had, were still considered low risk. Dawn herself never seemed afraid, and maybe that was part of the problem. To her, fear meant failure. These whales had been taken from their families, stuffed into concrete tanks, turned into entertainment. If anyone was going to restore trust between human and beast, it was her. So when someone said, "He seems off this week," she'd smile and say, "He just needs more time." When a colleague warned, "Maybe let someone else do the session," she'd say, "No, he knows me." She wasn't arrogant, she was loyal, and that loyalty became her blind spot. As 2010 began, staff noted a shift in Tillicum. He was eating more, erratically, floating motionless for hours, swimming in slow, repetitive circles. Veterinarians attributed it to boredom and age. He was over 30, old for a captive orca. But those who'd worked with him closely started using another word, unstable. Dawn kept working with him anyway. She adjusted their routine, cut back the number of physical cues, spent more time interacting from the platform instead of in the water. To most visitors, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Dawn would still stand beside him, gently resting her hand on his back, whispering something only he could hear. The crowd would clap. The moment would pass. But tension was building, like pressure under the surface of the sea, waiting for the right moment to rise. On the morning of February 24, 2010, Dawn arrived early. She reviewed the session plan, greeted staff, and walked over to Tillicum's pool with her usual calm. Nothing felt off, or maybe she was just used to the feeling. What no one realized was that all the missed signals, the uneasy glances, the quiet warnings, they weren't just background noise, they were the drumbeats of a storm about to break. February 24, 2010, began like any other sunny Wednesday in Orlando. At SeaWorld, trainers moved through their morning routines. The smell of salt water and the sound of splashing echoed through the stadium as whales breached and dove during their early warm-ups. Guests were starting to filter in for the Dine with Shamu event, an up-close, more intimate performance where visitors could eat lunch while watching trainers interact with the park's most famous whales. Dawn Branchot was smiling that morning, calm, composed, focused, as always. She wore her signature black wetsuit, her blonde ponytail tied tight, clipboard in hand. At 40, she was at the top of her game, highly respected, deeply admired, and regarded by many as the best in the field, and she was scheduled to work with Tilikum. Tilikum hadn't performed in the big splash shows for years. His history of aggression meant he was restricted from water work. But dry platform interactions, like what was planned for that day, were still permitted. There were quiet concerns behind the scenes. Earlier that week, a senior trainer noticed Tilikum being unresponsive to signals, delayed reactions. A sluggish demeanor and, most concerning of all, a kind of empty stillness in his gaze. For orcas, eye contact is everything. A shift in focus can signal fatigue, frustration, or unpredictability. That morning, a team member casually asked Dawn, "You sure you're good to go with Tilly today?" She nodded. "Yeah, he's fine." That's what she always said. And honestly, who was going to argue with her? If anyone could handle Tilikum, it was Dawn. The session started off as planned. A dozen or so guests sat at tables overlooking the tank, eating lunch, chatting, occasionally pulling out phones to snap photos. Some were families from out of state. One couple had brought their 3-year-old son. Everyone was relaxed. Dawn stood at the edge of the pool, casually giving signals to Tilikum. He responded, slowly but accurately. He surfaced, waved a fin, let out a low vocalization. Then, at one point, he rolled over and presented his belly, something orcas are trained to do when comfortable. It was almost like a quiet dance, familiar, routine. But what happened next? No one was ready for. According to reports and witnesses, Dawn was interacting with Tilikum at the edge of the pool, crouched low beside the water, offering him fish and gently playing. Then, in a blink, he surged upward. Some say he grabbed her ponytail. Others believe it was her arm or her wetsuit. Either way, the motion was violent, fast, and intentional. One moment, she was smiling. The next, she was yanked into the water with terrifying force. Screams erupted, guests froze. One mother instinctively turned her child away. A father knocked, over his drink, shouting, "Call someone! Get help!" Inside the control room, emergency protocols were activated. Sirens blared through the backstage area. Trainers raced to the scene. But what they saw was chilling. Tilikum was thrashing in the water, dragging Dawn under, resurfacing only to shake her again. Over and over, she tried to break free, kicking, twisting, but she didn't stand a chance. He was 12,000 pounds of raw muscle and frustration. Her body slammed into the pool walls. At one point, she surfaced, reaching toward the platform, blood visible in the water. Then he pulled her down again. And this time, she didn't come back up. It took 45 minutes to recover her body. By the time they could lure Tilikum into a smaller holding tank, it was too late. Dawn's injuries were devastating. Broken bones, torn scalp, massive internal trauma. She had drowned. But more than that, she had been destroyed. People couldn't believe it. The same trainer who kissed Tilikum's head was now dead by his mouth. In the aftermath, SeaWorld halted all shows. News helicopters circled the park. Crowds gathered at the gates. Journalists pushed microphones toward grieving staff members. How could this happen? They asked. Some blamed the whale. Others blamed the company. But most were left in stunned silence, repeating the same haunting words. She loved him, she trusted him, and he killed her. What happened to Dawn Brancheau on February 24, 2010, didn't just break SeaWorld's heart. It broke America's illusion. For decades, the Shamu shows had been a staple of family vacations, part performance, part fantasy, enormous killer whales, leaping into the sky, soaking crowds, nuzzling up to their human trainers as if they were loyal pets. It was beautiful, emotional, magical. And then in the span of minutes, it all collapsed. It wasn't a show. It was a struggle to survive. When Tilikum launched himself out of the water and grabbed Dawn, it wasn't part of a routine. There was no cue, no command, no playful intent. It was sudden, brutal, and calculated. Eyewitnesses described the scene as pure chaos. The sound of water thrashing, the heavy thud of Tilikum's body slamming against the pool walls, screams echoing through the stadium. One woman dropped her phone and fell to her knees, crying. A father rushed his children out of the viewing area, shielding their eyes. Inside the tank, Dawn was fighting for her life. But against a creature weighing 6 tons, with jaw strength capable of crushing bone, she didn't stand a chance. Tilikum held her, spun her, pulled her beneath the surface, again and again. This wasn't the first time. Tilikum had a history. In 1991, he was involved in the drowning of a young trainer in Canada. In 1999, a man was found dead draped across his back inside the SeaWorld tank after sneaking in overnight. He was labeled dangerous years before Dawn's death, but SeaWorld kept him. He was their prized male, valuable for breeding, and a central attraction. They said the previous deaths were either accidents or unauthorized interactions. This time, there was no gray area. This was a full-scale, witnessed-on-the-spot killer whale attack. The rescue attempts were desperate. Trainers banged on the sides of the pool with metal poles. Gates were lowered in an attempt to isolate Tilikum. They tried, using food, hand signals, even familiar sounds to distract him. But he wouldn't let go. It was as if something had snapped inside him. All the years of confinement, of routines, of being made to perform for fish, it all seemed to come to a head. And the one person he had always trusted, the one person who had always defended him, was now in his grasp, and he wasn't letting go. When the emergency team finally managed to lure him into a smaller tank, it was too late. Dawn's body was recovered, but barely intact. Her scalp had been ripped from her head. Her jaw was broken. Her arm was severed. She had suffered multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and had ultimately drowned. What had started as another sunny day at a theme park ended in an unspeakable tragedy witnessed by families, tourists, and children who would never forget it. The world responded with shock, grief, and rage. The news spread like wildfire. SeaWorld trainer killed by whale dominated headlines. People were confused, angry, betrayed. For decades, they had been told these whales were safe, that trainers were in control, that nothing could go wrong. Now they knew the truth. Control was an illusion. Talk shows debated whether killer whales should ever be in captivity. Animal rights organizations like PETA called for SeaWorld to shut down its orca programs. Celebrities tweeted their support for Dawn's family while also questioning the ethics of keeping ocean predators in tanks smaller than a parking lot. And at the center of it all was a 12,000-pound whale who had killed 3 people and a woman who had spent her life trying to love him into peace. Dawn's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a turning point in how America viewed marine parks. It opened wounds, it opened conversations, and it forced a nation to ask, what? Do we owe the animals we put in tanks for entertainment? After the attack, SeaWorld shut down all shows for days. The music stopped. The crowds disappeared. What once echoed with laughter and applause now echoed with silence and grief. There were no more smiling families taking pictures by the tank. No more Shamu splash zone warnings, just flowers outside the gates and reporters with cameras asking a question no one wanted to answer. How could this happen? Dawn Brancheau's death shattered more than just the lives of her family and co-workers. It shattered a carefully constructed narrative, one SeaWorld had built over decades. A story that told us these whales were safe in tanks, that they were happy, that they formed bonds with their trainers, that everything we were watching was beautiful and under control. But in that tank, in that horrifying moment, the illusion broke, and the world saw the truth. Tilikum, the 12,000-pound orca, who killed Dawn, was immediately placed in isolation. He was no longer part of shows, no longer performing, just swimming in slow circles in a back tank, alone. He lived in that isolation for another 7 years, until his death in 2017. Some people mourned him, others didn't. For SeaWorld, it was the start of a massive reckoning. Government officials launched investigations. Safety protocols were rewritten. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, fined the park and eventually banned trainers from swimming with orcas during performances. Dawn's death forced the entire marine entertainment industry to face what it had avoided for too long. Wild animals, no matter how well trained, are still wild. Then came Blackfish. The 2013 documentary pulled the curtain all the way back. It told Tilikum's story, from his capture in the wild as a baby to the deaths he was linked to, and exposed the psychological toll captivity takes on orcas. The footage was raw. The interviews were emotional. The message was clear. This was never safe. Not for the animals, not for the humans. The film sparked a nationwide backlash against SeaWorld. Attendance dropped, sponsors pulled out, celebrities spoke out, activists rallied. Parents began questioning whether they should take their kids to see whales perform tricks for food. In 2016, SeaWorld announced it would end its orca breeding program and phase out theatrical orca shows altogether. It was a massive shift, a moment of accountability years in the making. But for some, especially those close to Dawn, it came too late. Her family never blamed Tilikum. They never even blamed SeaWorld outright. What they mourned most wasn't just her death. It was the silence that followed. The way people turned her into a symbol, a headline, a hashtag. But Dawn wasn't a martyr. She was a woman who gave her life to animals, who believed love, trust, and patience could bridge the gap between species. She saw something good in Tilikum even when others didn't. That's who she was, and that's what makes her death so hard to accept. Because if even she couldn't control what happened, who could? Tilikum wasn't evil. He was a wild creature, ripped from his mother's side in the ocean at age 2, held in tanks for decades, used to breed, and made to perform for food. His aggression wasn't unnatural. It was inevitable. Maybe Dawn saw that pain in him. Maybe that's why she stayed close, even when others stepped away. But in the end, the very love she gave so freely was what cost her everything. Now, years. Later, we're left with a question no one wants to ask, but everyone needs to answer. Do we really believe love is enough to tame the wild, or, deeper still, have we been so desperate to connect with nature that we've forgotten to respect it? If you've made it this far, thank you. Stories like Dawn's are not just about tragedy. They're about truth, a truth that challenges us, haunts us, and forces us to look in the mirror. At Animal Story, we tell the hard stories, because they matter. If this one moved you, if it made you feel something, please subscribe, and let us know in the comments, if you were Dawn, would you have trusted Tilikum, or should some animals never be caged, no matter how much we love them? We'll see you in the next story. Stay human, stay kind, and stay curious.